everyone, and welcome back to part one of our Social Contracts podcast brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Arizona. I'm GraceMarie Theesfeld, your host for today's episode. Today, we're going to continue our conversation on the Declaration of Independence, exploring its meanings and looking for more modern applications. 250 years ago, the Declaration of Independence did more than announce freedom. It declared a social contract. It said that the government exists only within the consent of the governed, that the government has a duty to secure the rights and representation of the people. Those principles, liberty, justice, accountability, became the foundation for the Constitution. And just over a decade later, they were written into the Bill of Rights. Freedom of speech and press, the right to assemble, freedom of religion, due process, equal protection. The Declaration of Independence voiced the grievances. The Bill of Rights set down the remedies. Together, they defined what we the people expect from our government. The colonists were demanding a government that served the people, not the other way around. And today, those expectations remain urgent. Joining me for today's conversation are several fabulous fellow college students in Arizona, Mikah, Ari, and Emra. The grievances in the Declaration of Independence can feel like a long catalog of complaints, but they really weren't random at all. We've talked about how they revealed a pattern of power used to control, to silence, and to weaken the people. And just a reminder that in this podcast series, we've grouped the 27 grievances from the Declaration into 6 key themes: violations of representative government and self-governance, abuse of judicial power, taxation without representation, economic restriction and control, military oppression, and acts of tyranny and war. There are 6 themes, but they all carry the same message. For our discussion today, we're going to focus on the colonists' condemnation that their judicial system was, in essence, rigged against them, the people. To start the conversation off, let's begin by listening to the listed grievances, number 8, 9, and 18, read for us by Emra.
Grievance 8. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. Grievance 9. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. Grievance 18. For depriving us in many cases of the benefit of trial by jury.
Panelists, let's jump into our discussion. Today, our first question for consideration is, in these grievances, the colonists stress the importance of having independent judicial systems. What do you think happens when people lose faith in the fact that justice is both impartial and fair?
Well, I think we're seeing that right now as the Supreme Court is making decisions that are being blatantly ignored by our administration. The Supreme Court has made a couple decisions lately that the current administration has just completely ignored.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the time, too, when I'm talking with other people, and we see that, like, in communities that kind of are experiencing, like, different systemic biases, and with, like, whether that's with policing or courts, and where decisions are seeming to kind of favor those that are in power rather than the people it's impacting, that a lot of the time you might see someone who doesn't want to call the police because even if they're in a dangerous situation, they're in fear of what may happen, or, they don't trust the court system, that they're never going to be able to side with me because they're always going to side with those that are in power because I don't look like those who are in power. And so I think it's hard because increasingly, like, I think it's important for people to have trust in institutions. That's how we have, like, a functioning society and a functioning democracy. But we're seeing an increase of people not trusting those institutions because they continue to not benefit from them. So.
Yeah, and one symbol I think of when I think of independent judicial systems is that, like, Lady Justice statue who has a blindfold and a sword and sort of that, like, balanced scales. And to me, that represents 2 things, right? That justice should be blind and impartial to everyone, right? So no matter if you have wealth, what class you are, where you're coming from, everyone should be treated the same way in terms of the law. And second, unfortunately, justice is swift with the sword and also balanced. So judges should not be influenced, like we are saying. We have a lot of political infiltration and partisan infiltration in our justice system with judges, and I think that oftentimes it can be really scaled to one side, which can be unfortunate and also make some people feel inferior or that they can't, hold as much power as they are entitled to.
Yeah, I think one thing that really stands out to me as we discuss this conversation is, like Mikah mentioned, the influence of biased police forces. This has been on my mind recently as I just kind of reflect back on like last year's election and like voting for, I think it was in Pima County, we got a new county sheriff. And how when you run for county sheriff, you have to pick a party to affiliate with, which just seems so odd to me because, again, like we've been talking about, justice and enforcing the law should be something that is not done from a partisan status. And I think that causes, among other things, people to really lose faith in policing and the justice system in America. And it feels very frustrating as a bystander that there's not a whole lot that I can do to change that system. And I think it goes back to emphasizing the value in voting and making your voice heard when you can. But then it's like two sides of the same coin, right? Because on the flip side of that, you have, okay, well, let's vote. Let's get out and vote. That's really important. But when people start to lose faith that justice is actually being handled when you vote, it kind of, I don't want to say disengages people, but it really makes people kind of lose faith. It feels very paralyzing, I guess.
Yeah, and you make a good point, Grace, on voting. And I think not many people know that we can actually vote for judges in Arizona. But even then, like in talking to individuals, they're like, oh, well, how do they feel about this issue? So it always goes back to like that partisan standpoint. Yeah. And I feel like they feel like there's an obligation that they have to take one side or another.
Yeah. Or I think we see it with like ICE and what's happening right now in our communities in Arizona. And I mean, across the country, but we see tons of, elected officials, whether they're state legislators or city council members, speaking out against what ICE is doing, but still nothing. So it seems like, what could I do as a person? And you see countless videos on social media of people that are just being swiftly taken away, and there really isn't any, like, they don't know what's happening. There's no one's telling them, and a lot of times members of ICE are masked, and so it's just like, it's really like a scary thing in our community. And so I think that is where people are now even more increasingly having a distrust of the system. So it's definitely very worrying.
Yeah, and especially to that like vulnerable population, a lot of the times law and justice can seem inaccessible to them. For example, like if a lawyer doesn't speak Spanish, or they just like don't understand the different cultural or individual experiences that they've undergone. And I think a lot of the times it can feel out of reach for those people.
Yeah, I think cultural competency in this is huge, because we talk a lot about like equality and justice being blind, but I think there are certain circumstances where justice can't be blind, because you have to acknowledge the fact that there are certain structures and biases that exist so heavily in America that we have no choice. We should have no choice but to acknowledge them and to say, because of these circumstances, this group of people deserves extra focus, And I think that's a really important nuance to add to this, is that, yes, while justice should be blind and fair, we also need to be understanding of the fact that, there are certain groups of people who need equity, not just equality.
Yeah, pulling on equity versus equality, I was about to say that. I stole my...
Great minds think alike.
Yeah. I think that's why grassroots organizations are so important. Yeah. And it also goes back to what Mikah was saying about that feeling of powerlessness that a lot of people have. You can get involved within like grassroots organizations and within community-based organizations that just have the intention of just helping people. Like with the SNAP benefits being shut down right now, you can get involved with your local church, your local community center, and help give food out to people who need it.
Yeah, a lot of universities have been at the forefront of that as well. The university I go to has a food bank set up for students that I think is just a huge resource in times like these, because students are already a vulnerable population when it comes to accessing food. So now with the government being shut down and SNAP and EBT benefits being halted, I think that's an especially important resource to emphasize. Okay, we can move into our second question. How might obstructing the creation of courts or legal systems affect the daily lives of citizens? And how might that shape their rulings and people's rights?
I think one of the first things that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, but that I see now is kind of when we see regions that have underfunded or kind of overburdened courts, then the justice is delayed.
Yeah.
And we see that countless times in like immigration court, where it takes years and years for people to go through and have their case processed and be able to, adjudicate that or gain citizenship. And so that's what creates a lot of the problems that we're seeing. But we see countless times where, it's hard to become a judge, and that's a hard job to have. But then also, under different administrations, we've seen like the removal of judges and all of these different things. And so I think it leaves citizens frustrated and vulnerable because they're just laying kind of in limbo within the system. And then that's where a lot of these dangerous situations happen, where they might run into different policing structures or things like that. And so I think it can be very damaging to communities, especially because they're sitting kind of in this area where they don't know what to do or how to act. So
yeah, something that stands out to me as you just mentioned that with the government being shut down right now and the overburdened courts and overburdened systems in general, I think is especially important to mention because, you have court systems where you have folks who are trying to serve justice and to provide services to people, even though they're not being paid. And that feels to me like something that would stifle and obstruct justice and is especially relevant now.
Yeah, and one term that really comes to mind is packing the courts. We see that a lot when an administration is at the end of its term and it's wanting to just throw in as many federal judges as they can that side with their political beliefs and party. And we've seen that a lot recently, and I think it can be very damaging to our democracy and keeping open dialogue and just overall representation on all sides.
Yeah. And I think that kind of brought up to me, I think one of the interesting things that I hear countless times, and you brought it up earlier, is like the Supreme Court is making all these decisions that are affecting our lives.
Yeah.
But it's the one branch in our government that
we have
really
no control.
There's no accountability.
Right.
And so it's interesting. And I don't know, it's maybe a separate conversation, but an interesting thing to think about on what reforms can be brought to the Supreme Court
100%.
in terms of bringing more accountability and bringing it more towards a democratic system. Should there be term limits on Supreme Court justices or what should that look like? Because I think that's what also frustrates people. And I think we're lucky in the state of Arizona, not all states are like that, where we, have the ability to approve Supreme Court justices and things like that. And so I think that lack of accountability kind of separates the people to those who are in power a little bit.
Yeah, I agree.
Judges are supposed to be completely nonpartisan, and so I think the main issue we're seeing is judges consistently taking the side of one party over and over again. And so the whole point of the judicial branch, being its own independent branch, is the fact that it's nonpartisan. And when it becomes partisan, that's when we see all these unfair rulings start to emerge.
Yeah, I even think about checks and balances, right? The judicial system has so much power in sort of, they're supposed to be the guards, right, of our Constitution and our laws, and I think they are one of the only ones that can really check the executive branch when it does something too extreme. And I think when something like that happens, when they are favoring one administration or party, then that power sort of goes away, and we also lose trust and faith in that institution.
I agree. I want to put a spin on this question and ask you guys to consider how might the creation of new legal systems affect the daily lives of citizens. And what I'm thinking about as I ask this question is the Department of Government Efficiency that was recently put into place, and how that has impacted the lives of citizens. And if it hasn't, are there other structures and new systems and forms of justice that you see impacting the daily lives of our community?
Well, the first thing I think of with that department is the mass firing of government employees. That directly impacts the lives of those people when people are massively being fired. And on top of that, it not only leaves a bunch of people without jobs, it also overburdens those departments, because now the people who are left have to carry all of that work.
Yeah, that was kind of something that I was considering. I have had family members who have worked in the Veterans Administration and the Veterans Hospitals, who are getting those emails about, name 3 things that you did that were productive today. I'm a nurse. Like, I'm saving lives. Like, what do you want me to say? And I think it's just so ridiculous to be wasting the times of people who should be giving justice in the form of healthcare. Like, especially to veterans who have served the country. It just seems like, to me, it feels like an obstruction of justice in a more nuanced form of the word.
Absolutely. And to me, especially like that department seems almost like a ploy or a distraction because, on surface value, it seems like they're doing something beneficial, but in reality, they're doing the opposite. And I think it's just ironic how that all plays out. And I don't think anything justice related is going on in that department.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, we'll move into our third question. How is the court's role in the social contract reflected in these grievances?
Well, the whole point of the court is to essentially serve as a bridge between the people and the government to make sure the government is upholding its end of the social contract. And I feel like when the courts are as partisan as they are now, they can't fulfill their duty in making sure the government is upholding their contract because they're so focused on the individual cases like party alignment.
Yeah, that reminds me of Grievance 9, and we have this language here that describes he has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. And that feels so relevant to what is going on today, especially as we talk about Supreme Court justices and judges being influenced by parties and the partisan desires, to drive what they're doing in the courts. It's very eerie.
Yeah. And I think something that like is important and people realize is like we give up some of our freedoms in exchange for kind of protection and fairness by the courts. But that, like, as you mentioned in grievance number 9, like when judges become kind of dependent on the ruler, that social contract becomes broken. And the government kind of fails to serve and protect us as citizens. And I think it kind of like goes back to an interesting point because I think judges are in fear a little bit of retribution at this point.
Yeah.
But it's also been like back in the 80s and 90s, kind of post-Reagan administration, there's been efforts by, conservatives to kind of, they understood the importance of courts. And there have been organizations that have consistently tried to implement, conservative justices across the United States on the Supreme Court.
Right.
And a lot of the times those justices, they get in that position and then they're beholden to those, either the funders or the leaders of that organization. Yeah. And then, that organization is beholden to, the leader of the party and that different thing. And so that's people begin to kind of realize those different things and feel that, they held up, us as citizens upheld our end of the bargain, but the other side didn't. So,
yeah.
Yeah, and I also think that people expect to count on the courts to safeguard when the government is not upholding its side of the social contract, kind of like Ari was alluding to. And I just read yesterday that a federal judge actually ordered the Trump administration to pay SNAP benefits out of the contingency fund, which I think is obviously good for those because millions of Americans rely on those SNAP benefits to, feed themselves and their families. And when the government, like we were talking about, has those bureaucratic sort of restrictions and aren't timely with the government shutdown, ultimately the people suffer. And, it really shows how the social contract cannot be upheld when the government is not doing right by its people. So at least, we can count on some federal judges and courts to, check them and offer benefits for people.
Yeah, I think also something to mention here, which should have brought up in the first question, but I think the violence that you inflict on people when you take away their access to such a basic human right like food is like jaw-droppingly horrific. Like, oh my goodness. The fact that we have waited even this long to hear from a federal judge to say, no, you have to make sure that people can eat. Hello? Like, what are we talking about? This is like, people they're starving. Like, it's so frustrating to me. And I feel like that is a real consequence when people violate the social contract, is that we the people are the ones who have to absorb the violence.
Yeah. And in the richest country in the world,
right.
And we can't figure out how to feed the hungriest in our society.
Yeah.
So. Yeah. And it also falls back on the people and community organizers and community organizations like food banks, who ultimately feel some sort of moral responsibility to help those people. And, we've seen the enormous long lines at the St. Mary's Food Bank in downtown.
Yeah.
And, obviously there are some good citizens who volunteer and donate, but ultimately there's only so much that they can do. And, I think that in a long term, it can really hinder and suffer people.
Yeah, definitely. I think also it reflects kind of that when our court systems fail us and when our government fails us, we the people still feel a social contract to each other to take care of each other and be like, we'll pool together these resources. We might not be able to fix the problem entirely, but we're going to do the best we can to address it. And I think in times where hope is so few and far between, I think that that's something to really hold dear to your heart, that, there are organizations and there are groups of people who feel obligated to look out and care for their other community members. Yeah. Okay, we will transition into our last question here for discussion. What sort of impacts do you all see in society when the justice system is impacted by delays or corruption?
I think people turn to other ways when they feel powerless and they feel like they can't turn to an institution or democratic ways. People turn to violent ways.
I agree, yeah.
And, we saw it in the civil rights movement with MLK and Malcolm X. And obviously there's still debate today on those two different processes and ways to obtain justice. But ultimately, when there are delays and people feel like justice isn't being administered, it's not fair, people take to the streets. And that is their right as a democracy. And I feel that people shouldn't judge based on their position in society on what others do to obtain their freedom.
I completely agree with that. And going back to one of our key themes for this episode being a judicial system rigged against the people, to your point of when there's kind of this circular effect that we see where, there's institutional violence, like people being deprived of their SNAP and EBT benefits. And so they turn to more violent means of obtaining what they need to survive. And then you see those people prosecuted for doing what they need to do to survive. So it just reinforces that idea of the justice system being rigged against the people, because somehow we, the people, are the ones who are blamed for the failings of the judicial systems and the federal courts.
And it's not just violence against the government. It's, no, I don't want to say violent, but like breaking the law, I guess. You're going to see more people needing to steal from stores. You're going to see when abortion is taken away, you see these underground abortion rings of people just trying to access health care.
Yeah, which are so dangerous.
Yeah, and you see more danger arising just because people can't access their basic rights.
Mm-hmm. I think with the government shutdown as well, too, I think of all the people who will be impacted by that in ways that don't have anything to do with SNAP or EBT benefits. People who are filing family proceedings in courts and they don't have access to that, or people who travel for work, like we don't have air traffic controllers and TSA agents, which feels like a threat to security for the nation. And it all feels very dystopian. And all the while, there is some gold-coated ballroom being built in Washington, D.C. It just like blows my mind. And, like, historically speaking, people have always kind of like made fun of the French people because they're like, oh, the people in France are always rioting. At least they're standing for something. And it's like, it reminds me of that famous quote, like, oh, let them eat cake, where she's like, the queen is gorging herself on all the stuff, and then the people of France are dying. And it feels like that is exactly what is happening in the United States as we speak, where, people don't have access to food. Justice is being obstructed, and there's like a fancy ballroom being built in Washington, D.C. Like, I am so glad my tax dollars are going to that instead of giving families the food they need.
And not even a fancy ballroom, but, yesterday was Halloween, and Trump had a Great Gatsby Halloween party, and he only invited billionaires and the top 1%.
Right.
And like you said, GraceMarie, it feels so dystopian that there is a majority of people living in poverty, and then there's just people at the top who don't care and who have the means to actually do something.
Yeah.
And it's so almost fatiguing, and it makes you just say, like, why are we even like voting? Why are we even doing this if nothing is being done and nothing is changing? It's just getting worse.
Yeah, I definitely see where you come from with that. I think it's important to emphasize in those times, like, your vote does matter, especially in local elections where you have a smaller locus of control, where you are under the influence. Some of these community programs are under the influence of your city council and your mayor. And in Tucson especially, this was really important to me and really opened my eyes. We had a lot of data centers trying to push in to build in Pima County. And because of civic engagement and local voting, we were able to stop that, at least for now. And I think that it is really just so important to emphasize, even when your lack of control in federal issues feels so paralyzing, voting still matters so much, especially in the local level, because that's where communities are going to feel it.
Yeah. And one of the things that I was kind of thinking about, too, in terms of corruption, and especially in Arizona, is the problem with private prisons. Mm-hmm. And so we've kind of set up a system where we're incentivizing the jailing of Arizonans, and because the jails will make more money and all these different things, and that in Arizona, private prisons are receiving more funding than our public schools. And that, for decades, we've seen the underfunding of public schools in certain zip codes. And so where you grow up is going to determine the level and the success of the education you receive. And then that down the line, goes into, if someone doesn't receive a great education, they're not going to get a great job. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have a great job, then you're going to fall into poverty. And we see, poverty leads to crime. And so there's kind of this long, there's so many policies that go in to this system. And so I think I think people are beginning to realize it, but to understand that, this has been something that has been ingrained kind of in American institutions for decades. And so it's a lot of work to kind of begin to unravel a lot of it.
100%.
Yeah, and when you mentioned voting, GraceMarie, I think in odd year elections, we see that people turn out less to the polls and vote less. But I think this year we had a lot of great propositions that really impacted education and public schools, and even like healthcare initiatives. And I think I was really happy to see a lot of marketing and people showing out and advertising almost, what impacts these propositions would have. And it was, I think, an all mail-in election, and most people in Arizona mail in their ballots, so it was pretty accessible to folks.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great point to make. As we've seen today, the grievances listed in the Declaration of Independence weren't just a random list of complaints. They reflected deeper concerns about representation, justice, and the abuse of power. Thank you for joining us for episode 4 of Social Contract in Action podcast with the theme Breaking Away, Judicial System Rigged Against the People, brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Arizona. We hope today's discussion gave you new insights into the Declaration and the way its principles still echo in our civic life today.
Be sure to tune in to our next episode as we'll continue to explore the 27 grievances, what they teach us about the social contract, and how we can view them through a modern lens.